From ancient Germanic legend, today we're going to be looking at the legendary sword called Gram from Volsunga Saga. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and today we're going to be looking at a recreation of the legendary sword Gram and a little bit about what that sword is and its history. So most of you are aware that I work with Windlass and various other companies as well, but specifically with Windlass on the Royal Armouries line, developing historical replicas. And in fact, I've got a new range coming out with Windlass and more about that information in due course. But I spend most of my time looking at museum originals, sometimes private collection originals of historical artifacts, and this is a very quick preview of something I've been working on. More about that in due course. So most of the weapons I look at, unlike the Gram sword we're going to look at here, are based on historical originals, or at least inspired by historical originals, or an amalgamation of historical originals. This Gram sword is a little bit different. We'll look at the scabbard in a second. Now, one of the things to say about this is essentially, you could call it a fantasy, mythological, legendary sword. So it is based on some Viking swords, we'll talk about that in a second, but is fundamentally a work of imagination of a legendary sword from a Viking saga. That saga is a Volsunga saga. Now, I'm not going to give you a potted history of the whole saga. It's worth reading about yourself. In fact, there's a very good Wikipedia page on it if you just want to read something fairly quick about it, but it's a really, really cool story. Now, we don't actually know when the saga dates from originally. Okay, it's clearly an old Germanic tale. Obviously, it relates to Scandinavian, but also even Burgundian culture, so it might go back hundreds of years. But we have a 13th century rendition of it. Now, obviously, 13th century is after the Viking Age. And this is something that I think a lot of people don't realise, is that a lot of the so-called Viking sagas that we have, actually the written down versions that we're familiar with or have the most detail, are actually dating to after the Viking Age. So they're oral histories that have been passed down through communities, through families, and eventually, in the Christian age, in the 13th century in this case, were written down. Now, one of the nice differences with the Volsunga saga is we actually have, from Sweden, this carved stone actually showing key scenes or kind of episodes from the saga itself. Now, interestingly, on that stone is actually shown a sword, which obviously it's very crude and it's a very simple representation, but does bear some similarity in outline to this replica that Windlass have made. Now, I should point out, this is based on the saga, okay? So this isn't necessarily the sword that would exist hundreds of years before the saga was written down. This is actually a sword which, in its general form, is more contemporary in its overall design with the 11th century. In other words, the period when this stone was made, which is thought to have dated to around maybe 1030, certainly the early, just after 1000 AD. So in terms of context, this is a bit like the historically inspired versions of Excalibur that people might make. This is a legendary sword from a story. We don't have any idea really, apart from the description in the saga, of what the original one would have looked like. But this is a rendition of one inspired by various bits of that saga. Okay, so it is an interesting junction between fantasy swords and historical swords. This is somewhere in the middle, which I think is a really interesting concept, and is something that was even done in period as well, whether it's the 15th, 16th or 19th centuries. There have been people in historical times making swords that alluded to or claimed to be from earlier periods. And many of the legendary swords of state, or if we take something like the swords of Charlemagne, we know that they contain earlier elements and later elements, but nevertheless held a very important symbolic role. So I think this sort of fits into that kind of category. So very loosely speaking, although this is a sort of legend-inspired, partial fantasy, partial historical sword, it is very obviously a Viking-type sword, and this particular form of hilt probably has its closest historical parallel to things like the Langade sword from Norway. Now, interestingly, that group of swords doesn't fit within the Peterson typology because Peterson didn't know about them. There's a whole group of late Viking era swords, 11th, kind of 10th, 11th century, even beyond that actually, that he didn't know about and he didn't classify. So while we sometimes talk about Peterson type E or Peterson type A hilts. This isn't a Peterson type anything because he didn't classify this because he didn't know about them. But nevertheless, it is a genuine group of swords, or at least this is related to and partially inspired by the group of swords that some people would refer to as the Langade type of Norwegian late Viking sword. And this is an interesting period because this is a period when Christianity was coming into that part of the world as well. So the Langade sword, for example, contains some Christian symbology actually, or symbolism rather, on the hilt. This, however, doesn't. This is based on the Volsunga Saga. So the legendary sword Gram featured in the Volsunga Saga was originally a gift from Odin to Sigmund, and he used it for various valiant deeds. It eventually got broken, but his son Sigmund, when he came to need a sword, the broken pieces were reforged. This is where you find things like in Tolkien, for example, the idea of reforging the broken shards of a sword to create a new sword. This, in its time, cut through an anvil was one of the tasks that it achieved. But most famously, it destroyed the dragon Fafnir. So Sigmund needed a sword to destroy the dragon, Fafnir, that he had agreed to go and kill. He dug a trench in the ground and he stabbed the dragon from beneath. So this is a sword that was owned by his father and him. It was broken in the middle, reforged, and then went on to kill a dragon. Now, the hilt of this sword actually involves various elements of the saga into it and alludes to it. Although it has the general sort of outline that's a little bit like the Langade sword, certainly the crossguard is anyway, less so the pommel. It's got various runes put around it. It's got dragons on the guard. It's got a sort of dragon sort of representation on the pommel, as well as some runes around here. The runes translate to various words, serpent and fire and oak and things like this that relate to the story because the sword came from an oak tree. It's a long story. You should read the saga. It's good fun. Obviously, it destroyed a dragon. Fire was involved in reforging it and this kind of thing. So, in addition, it's also got some runes on the blade, but the blade is 1080 high carbon steel. It comes factory sharpened, and interestingly, the construction of this hilt is traditional in the sense that the upper part and the lower part of the pommel are two elements. This isn't one cast unit that's peened at the end. It's constructed how a lot of Viking era hilts, where you have a bar across here, that is peened to the full tang, which comes all the way through to here, and then that is a cap that sits on the top, and these are two rivets underneath. It has a cord impressed wet wrapped leather grip with a decorative band around the middle, which is something we find on a lot of Viking era and Anglo-Saxon swords. And as mentioned, the guard is very similar in form to the Langade sword, so essentially 11th century type. So this is, as I say, in basic outline, essentially an 11th century Viking era sword, but with fantasy legendary elements in the decoration of the hilt. Now, in the saga, it describes the hilt as, you know, bedecked in gold and sparkling and this kind of stuff. Sad to say this isn't gold, it is brass. However, it's brass that's had a darkened wash of patina put into it that actually, you know, looks pretty lustrous and fairly rich. So it actually gives the look, perhaps, of aged gold without actually being gold. The scabbard is very nicely made in period style. It's wood with leather stitched up the back. Nice quality leather. Smells nice of leather. It's wood, but it's actually leather lined, which means that when you sheath the sword, it has a particularly nice grip to it. And it's, you know, doesn't scratch the blade, it doesn't make any noise, it doesn't rattle around. So it sits in there really nicely. And it comes complete with a leather belt. Really nice package. Now, I should also mention, unlike many sort of swords of this ilk, this is completely functional. This is a sprung steel blade. So it's factory sharpened, so I'll be a little bit careful with my hand here, but it flexes in the correct way, so it's stiff in the first half of the blade, flexes in the second half of the blade, and yes, it has distal taper because, of course, so while I didn't design this sword and wasn't really directly involved in its development, I did give a little bit of feedback, and of course one of those is getting the correct distal taper and feeling in the blade. Now, in terms of how this thing handles, it's 1380 grams, so it's not a light sword, but it's not a heavy sword. It's kind of actually in the middle realm for large Viking era swords. And of course, it is intended to be used with a shield. It can be used on its own, of course. You can go out and chop things up in your backyard with it. You can chop up tatami mats or water bottles or whatever you like to chop. And it's perfectly strong enough for that. But in actual combat, it would be intended to be used with a Viking style shield. And it certainly cuts. Because that's what this type of sword is intended to be used at. So it's not necessarily nimble in the sense like a side sword or a saber would be. But it's plenty nimble enough to be used with a shield, and that is its intended purpose, crashing into helmets and mail and unarmoured bodies as well. So it's going to be a mighty old cleaving blade. Now, a little detail is, and again, this was something I put feedback into, a lot of replica Viking swords have a sort of midrib at the tip here, which is incorrect for this period. So the tip has been refined so it is smooth across this section with the correct tip shape. Tapering fuller, as I say, good distal taper, good sort of rotational point as well. And do you know what? Compared to a lot of Viking era hilts, this is a pretty comfortable hilt. So if you find that you struggle a bit with Viking era hilts, if you hold this correctly with your hand down to the bottom with the pommel sliding past the heel of the hand, I think you'll actually find this one pretty damned comfortable. So it's got authority to it, but it's quite comfortable to use, quite easy to use, and particularly well suited to using with a shield. So the Gram sword from Windlass, from the legendary Volsunga saga, inspired by that. If you like fantasy swords, but you also like Viking swords, this is the kind of mashover, crossover territory, the collaboration that you've been looking for. So check that out, a link down below. I've tried it out, I like it. It's a big, beefy Viking sword with a fantasy or mythological twist to it as well. So it's a pretty kind of unique thing, actually, pretty cool. And a type of Viking sword which hasn't been widely reproduced, actually, with a good old, big old, functional Viking blade on it. Anyway, check out the Gram sword from Windlass, link down below, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.